delighted to sponsor this series that we originally started co-sponsoring with the School of Professional Extended Studies, and we are now sponsoring with the Humanities Lab out of the College of Arts and Sciences. But tonight we have a law professor with us, Professor Richard Wilson, who is going to be talking to us about Common Sense by Thomas Paine. And before I finish introducing Professor Wilson, we've been trading quotes, and he has some that he's prepared for you in the back. So I'm going to open this program by telling you my favorite quote from this book. And the reason I think it's my favorite is if you put this in context, we declared independence in July of 1776. And this was written in December of 1776. It was published December the 10th. And it means that we were just getting started. We declared independence, but we didn't have it. And this book was written for a particular reason, and much of it, people think over time, was done to get a lot of people off the fence, that we really needed to truly separate from Britain. So if you keep that in mind, and having spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill, as perhaps somebody else in this audience has done, my favorite quote from this is, "A government of our own is our natural right. And when a man seriously reflects on the precariousness of human affairs, he will become convinced that it is infinitely wiser and safer to form a constitution of our own in cool, deliberate manner while we have it in our power, than to trust such an interesting event to time and chance." So to lead us through this discussion and to point out his favorite quotes from Common Sense is Professor Richard Wilson, who is a professor of law and the founding director of the International Human Rights Law Clinic at the law school. He's taught there since 1989, was a Peace Corps volunteer in Panama from 1966 to 68, is a 1972 graduate of the University of Illinois College of Law, and he began his career as a public defender. So he has taught at other law schools, including CUNY in New York City, before coming here. He's the co-editor of textbooks on international human rights law and practice, defense and international criminal law, and conducts clinical legal education in developing or transnational countries. Good man to talk about common sense.
Thank
Welcome.
you so much.
Thanks for
Nancy.
coming to this part of the campus.
Oh, it's terrific to be here. And thank you all for coming out on a cold night in January. I really appreciate your coming. I want to begin by thanking the library for hosting this event and all the wonderful staff, Danae and others who preceded her, who have been so generous with their time and pleasant and easy to work with about planning this event and putting it on. I think it's terrific, a terrific idea. Some of my colleagues have done it and encouraged me to do it, and I'm so glad that all of you are here. I am a lawyer, not a political scientist. I'm not a historian. So I read history for pleasure. And if there are historians in the room, particularly if you're on our faculty, forgive me. I don't pretend to be a historian. I picked this work in part because I have come across Thomas Paine in other contexts. And the one that is most particular to me is his work called The Rights of Man, which I noticed one of our colleagues reading as I came into the room. And I think it's been the one that I have gone back to and looked at most because of my work in international human rights. But as I read that particular work, it drew me to other work by Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine, the man, was something that was very, very interesting to me. Most of what I know about Revolutionary War history, I know from reading the novels of Kenneth Roberts and others from that period, who I think brilliantly captures that era. I'm going to focus on the period of time which it yields a number of works that are a part of this series. And we should note that this series is not the most popular books or the best sellers in American history, but the books that shape American history, the books that had a profound impact when they came out on the direction that America has gone and continues to go. So, they're not necessarily even the best books, but they are the ones that shape our country. And Common Sense can certainly claim that. One last note, this series is called Books That Shape the World, or shape the United States, shaped America. But it's hard to call Common Sense a book. It is a 46-page pamphlet. This is the original front piece of it. And it's anonymous, you'll notice. It took a while for them to figure out this was Thomas Paine, a little-known writer at the time. But we are calling it a book, and I'll say a little bit more about pamphlets as we go forward. I want to put this into context by talking about three themes tonight. I want to talk about what I'm calling the mood, the man, and the manuscript. So I want to focus on what was going on during that period of time. What's the context in which this happened? I want to introduce Thomas Paine, the man, so that you have a sense of who he is before I get to the manuscript itself, where I want to spend some significant period of time. I definitely want to leave some time at the end of the talk for questions, so I hope you'll stay and join me for questions you may have at the end. I have some slides. Most of them are pictures or cartoons, not text. And there is a handout in the back. Nancy mentioned it. If you don't have it, I encourage you to pick one up. It is some quotes from Common Sense that I think are the ones that I find most interesting. So if Danae, if folks, everybody have one of those? If you don't have one of them, you can raise your hand and she can get one for you. And we're going to make reference to that in a few minutes. So first, the mood. What was it that was going on in America at the time of the publication? Nancy has begun to hint at it. What is this particular historical period, and what's the political context in which Common Sense appears? Well, we have the colonies of the United States arrayed in 1775 in the red area, the 13 original colonies, not their same borders of today. You'll notice Virginia is a single area, and Massachusetts encompasses much of what is Maine today. Those colonies were all operating on their own at this period of time, often part of land grants from the monarchy in Britain. So they are George III, the king at this particular period of time, was seen as a guardian, a beneficent leader, at least by a majority of folks who are almost all counting themselves as loyalists. There is a loosely organized Continental Congress that's meeting in Philadelphia during this period of time. This is in this particular time of Common Sense, it is the Second Continental Congress. And most of the delegates at the end of 1775, this particular period of time, have kind of given up the idea of resistance and are looking to reconciliation. The delegations from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and South Carolina were instructed not to vote for independence. Maryland followed at the end of 1775, and Georgia wasn't taking part in the Continental Congress. It was only the 12 that were participating. One Tory delegate, a loyalist, argued in late 1775 that in the bars, he said, and I'm quoting, "the violent independents are less bold and insolent as their adherents are greatly diminished." So they were kind of losing spirit. Jefferson, Thomas, himself, a major drafter of the Declaration of Independence some 8 months later, referred during that period of time in his writings to ministerial troops led by ministerial officers rather than imputing any responsibility to the king himself for the wrongdoing that was going on in the colonies. Washington toasted the king to his troops through the end of 1775. All of that changed with the Battle of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, and made Paine and others radicals and patriots. Paine himself said, recalling his mindset before and after the Lexington confrontation, he said, "I had arrived a few months before. I had no thoughts of independence or of arms. The world couldn't have persuaded me that I should be either a soldier or an author. But when the country into which I had just set foot was set on fire about my ears, it was time to stir. It was time for every man to stir." The Second Continental Congress gathered in May after that confrontation and ended in July with the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. What was it that made them move from that disheartened mood at the end of 1775 so dramatically to the event of July of 1776, in which they signed the Declaration of Independence? It is that short period of time that I want to focus on tonight. Joseph Ellis, who is the author of the best-selling Founding Brothers, which did not include Paine, I might say. He was kind of seen and maybe continued to be seen as an outside agitator. He says in another book about that era called American Creation, he says the following about that particular historical moment. "It is no exaggeration to observe that between the summer of 1775 and the spring of 1776, the entire liberal agenda for the next century of American history made its appearance for the first time. Indeed, if one wished to push the evidence a bit, to include the civil rights and feminist movements, the next 2 centuries of political reform were previewed. But at the very least," he says, "the end of slavery, the recognition of women as citizens, and the expansion of the franchise to include the poor and propertyless were placed on the political table as inevitable consequences of the principles of the American Revolution that the American Revolution claimed to embody. The man who most passionately embraced this expanded agenda was Thomas Paine." So, we have heard a little bit about the mood. We have at least tangentially introduced the king. Here he is in his coronation garb. Pretty ritzy. And we have the man. This is one of the most common portraits of Thomas Paine, and I think one of the ones that I like the most because of the look on his face and his eyes, something about his particular demeanor that I like. Many of you have heard references to the Liberty Tree during that period of time in conjunction with the Revolution. It's a reference to an actual tree in Boston, an elm, where the revolutionaries met, they gathered. In defiance, loyalists during 1775 cut down the tree. Thomas Paine's earliest published works in the United States happened in September of 1775 when he wrote a song called The Liberty Tree. And I'm gonna spare you the singing, but because I don't know the melody. But here's the verse, the first verse at least. This is Tom Paine. But hear, O ye swains, 'tis a tale most profane, how all the tyrannical powers, kings, commons, and lords, are uniting amain to cut down this guardian of ours. From the east to the west, blow the trumpet to arms. Through the land, let the sound of it flee. Let the far and the near all unite with a cheer in defense of our liberty tree. He's agitating. He's mad. He's ready to go, and he's already beginning to begin to hear this mocking of the crown, of royalty, of the monarchy, of this history of the English monarchy. Who is this particular man? This author and soldier and so many more things. He was born with the last name Paine, P-A-I-N, no E at the end. He added it later on. Nobody knows why. He was born in Thetford, England in 1737 to humble parents. His father was a Quaker, his mother an Anglican. His father was a stay maker, not a stay maker of corsets, as he was oftentimes accused of being by those who detracted from Paine in later life, but a stay maker for ships. Even Wikipedia has that wrong, by the way. They say he was a son of a corset maker. He was pulled from school at 12 to apprentice his father. So that was all the formal schooling he got. And he learned the stay trade as a craftsman. In his younger years, he moved from Thetford to Lewis, the same spelling as our own Lewis in Delaware, a town that was known for its opposition to the monarchy. And he was married and elected to the town council and the church vestry. Sounds like a pretty settled life. But he lost his wife and child, and he began to move about. He became a seafarer and a tax collector and many other things. He didn't settle back with his father. He lived until 1809, when at age 72 he died. Not bad for that time. This is him in another portrait later in his life. And during his later years, after 1790, he moved to France. And having been firmly established as a hero of the revolution here, he was elected to the French National Convention, despite the fact that he spoke no French, because he was following and supporting the French Revolution that had begun in 1789. He spent most of the 1790s in France. He eventually fell prey to the Jacobins himself. He was put in jail and barely escaped the guillotine when a guard absent-mindedly marked his cell door with a cross on the inside of the door when the door was open. So when he closed the door, the X didn't appear anymore, and he was passed by. And by the time they figured all that out, he had figured out how to get himself out of prison. In France, he wrote The Rights of Men, The Rights of Man, largely in response to Edmund Burke, a British defender of the crown. And his work supported the French movement and other movements for the rights, the inherent natural rights of man. While he was there, he wrote one of his most remembered and also reviled works called The Age of Reason. And for that tract, he was convicted in absentia in England in 1792 for seditious libel. He stayed in France. He didn't go back to England. He returned to the United States and died essentially friendless with very few people at his funeral, in obscurity, because he had roundly criticized Washington, the general and president, and Christianity. Not a good thing to do in those days. He was not part, and is not today, I think, a part of the pantheon of the gods of the Revolution. But he does have a bust in the New York Historical Society, and that's about as famous as he gets. This is his bust in New York. Some of you may have gone to the Historical Society. Back in the day when he was living in England, he remarried and then separated in June of 1774 and left shortly after that for America. With him, he had only a letter of recommendation from Ben Franklin, who he had managed to meet on some occasion in England. And this was a letter of introduction which he carried for his son that referred to him as, and this is Franklin's quote, an ingenious, worthy young man. He was referred by Franklin as possibly a tutor or a clerk. No expectation that he would be one of the great revolutionary writers. He did prove to be ingenious. He actually took out a patent in his later life for the construction of a suspension bridge that he did in his spare time when he wasn't writing tracts attacking almost everyone. You can see the pattern here. He seemed to be a contrarian throughout his life. He was always writing against the grain, writing against the flow, and seemed to take great glee in it. He loved Philadelphia. He loved its atmosphere, its bars, its bookstores, and its book publishers. He was drawn to them all. So, let's look at the manuscript now. We've looked at the mood, the man, this manuscript. And I would maybe refer to the context of Philadelphia as, call it the Philly factor. The Constitutional Congress, the Continental Congress is meeting there. There are 6 daily newspapers. Imagine 6 daily newspapers. 27 presses, 30 bookstores in a town, a relatively small town for its time, an incredible abundance of intellectual stimulation that was going on around him at the time. A young Philadelphia doctor and radical named Benjamin Rush, a later signer of the Declaration of Independence, read Paine's work on African slavery in America. Of course, he attacked slavery way before its time, and recommended that he write something about independence. And Paine took it to heart. He wrote fairly steadily and had the manuscript that he produced reviewed by some folks. It's not clear entirely who these were in history, but they probably included Franklin himself, Sam Adams, another radical of that period, and others. He would publish, as you saw on the front piece, he would publish the manuscript anonymously, and he originally proposed to call it Plain Truth. But he changed the name when he realized that was something that Ben Franklin had already published by the same name, and he didn't want to be confused. It was published by a Scots printer, also part of the movement, Robert Bell, who used up all the paper he had in storage in his print house to produce 1,000 copies. They were optimistic that 1,000 would sell. When it came out, no one knew its author. Almost all assumed it was not the unknown, recently arrived Brit. It came out, my date was January 10th, 1776. I think you said December. I think the date I have is January 1776. The same day as the colonists received a speech the text of a speech from the king that was published, and that speech was particularly heinous, and the contrast was palpable between the speech and the new tract. Even the best of pamphleteers during this period of time had sold in one or two editions, maybe in the thousands. Pamphlets were quite popular as a form of publication during that period of time. There were hundreds of them beginning as early as 1763. By any account, Common Sense came out with some 24 editions, about 150,000 copies in its initial months, and some 500,000 over the period of the Revolution. Equivalent sales, proportionate sales today would put it around 15 million, which would make it the bestseller of all times, other than the Bible. It sold better, some say, in France, but there is no record of how many copies were sold. In the United States, historians say there is one copy of this pamphlet for every 5 people, one per family in the United States, the colonies. It drew scores of responses after it was published, so constant that historians can look to the papers during the months after it and before the Declaration and see a long story almost every day, certainly weekly, in the papers all up and down the coast. Particularly virulent attacks came from a loyalist who called himself Cato, whose letters were published in a Philadelphia paper. Paine responded to each of the letters at length, writing under the name of the Forester. One of the most powerful critics, loyalist James Calhoun from Maryland, said that the work, this is one of my favorites, threatened to degenerate us into democracy. God forbid, a most alarming development for the era. The tide had clearly turned, despite these counterattacks by the Tories and conservatives. His view prevailed. Charles Lee, one of the leaders of the Continental Army, used it to inspire his men before battle. It has, I think you can say briefly, and here we are at the work itself. If you have the little sheet, you can take a look. But it has, in my view, 4 central ideas. And you can, if you have the sheet, I think the first is that the people, not kings, are the natural source of government. The natural source, meaning always been there, always been true, part of natural law. Second, kings are not the people. Far from them. Arrogant, tyrannical, pampered fools. Maybe not his words, but he used words that we'll look at a little later that were similar, if not worse at the time. Third, he had a plan to structure the colonial government independently. There is one graphic depiction of this. This looks pretty complicated, I have to say. I found this online. It says source Common Sense. It looks pretty complicated. Actually, if you look at it more closely, it basically is a selection of delegates to an assembly that would write a constitution and then continue to serve. But the whole idea behind it was that they would serve for very short periods of time, a year, and then be replaced, and that the assembly would be a very large assembly. I think the total, I don't see the total number, but it's 390 delegates, no less than 30 per colony. So his idea was closer to our House of Representatives than, but he was talking about 390 with 12 colonies. So this is a big assembly. Very democratic in its constitution. And some of the detail in the work is focused on that structure. And fourth, and finally, he called for action now. Action now. So let's take a look. If you have the sheet, I think, with all due respect to Nancy, you picked out a favorite. When I look at, yeah, there are more. These are some I pulled from the work itself, some that others have thought were particularly influential. When you look at the front page of this front and back page handout, the one on government's role, the natural order of things, government's role, one of the ones that most impressed me is that last one that says that some writers have so confounded society with government as to leave little or no distinction between them, whereas they're not only different, but they have different origins. Society is produced by our wants, and government by wickedness. The former promotes our happiness positively by uniting our affections, the latter negatively by restraining our vices. I think a lot of people on my law faculty would agree with that. The one encourages intercourse, the other creates distinctions. The first is a patron, the last a punisher. So he takes a dim view of government, but as long as you're going to have one, he wants to have one that is highly representative. Secondly, he takes on the monarchy, and this is really my favorite part. This is where he really lets it fly, and I think this is the part where, when it was read aloud, he would get cheered wildly. The second quote. Of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God than all the crowned ruffians who ever lived. And the second quote on the second page, I've never seen this one in a collection of quotes, but when I came across it, I said, this is the best. England since the conquest hath known some few good monarchs, but grown beneath a much larger number of bad ones. Yet no man in his senses can say that their claim under William the Conqueror is a very honorable one. A French bastard leading with an armed banditti and establishing himself King of England against the consent of the natives is in plain terms a very paltry, rascally original. Now that's bold. It certainly hath no divinity in it. However, it is needless to spend much time in exposing the folly of the hereditary right. If there are some so weak as to believe it, let them promiscuously worship the ass and the lion, and welcome. So he has nothing but contempt for the monarchy. When it comes to the structure, he offers a structure. When it comes to a call for immediate action, and again here there are some of his most famous quotes come from this particular section. The short one at the beginning that says, it is not in numbers, but in unity that our great strength lies. And the last is probably one of the best known, not the one at the very bottom of the page, but the last in the section called immediate action. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. Not just America, the world. The call to France, the call to England, the call to other countries to begin the world over again. A situation similar to the present hath not happened since the days of Noah until now. The birthday of a new world is at hand, and a race of men, perhaps as numerous as all Europe contains, are to receive their portion of freedom from the events of a few months. The reflection is awful, and in this point of view, how trifling, how ridiculous do the little paltry cavillings of a few weak or interested men appear when weighed against the business of a world. He is truly a revolutionary. After its publication, and after he lived his long life, certainly not everyone loved him. Many despised him. John Adams is one of the most famous. He admired his ability to write, revered the work, but loathed the man. He called him a crapulous mass. That's a bad name. Closer to the event of his publication, his detractors called him a crack-brained zealot. The names never fazed him. In fact, I think the more names he was called, the more gleeful he became. In history, his works have been cited by liberals and by conservatives. I'm not sure these represent absolute views of either of those groups, but they'll stand for them in this particular instance. One of the greatest honors in history is to be depicted in political cartoons, and he was. The next 4 slides capture that. This is one from 1792, so he's now over in France. Who wants me? The roll says at the far side of the scroll. It also says rights of man, common nonsense, rights of property, and the rays sticking out of his head say things like anarchy, murder, treason, rebellion. There's a small note next to the arsenal on his back that says leveling instruments. Leveling instruments. And the scrolls that are trampled under his feet say religion, morality, obedience to the law, etc. So this is the Tory take. This one is the same cartoon replicated in a positive light. Here, the crown surrounding him is the titles of his many works. The quote on the scroll is one of tolerance of all faiths, and underfoot is the serpent of the divided colonies that he is stamping on. So, same picture, different take. Here's one that came out at the time that he published The Rights of Man, referring to him as Tommy Paine, the little American tailor, taking the measure of the crown for a new pair of revolutionary breeches. And above it says, humbly dedicated to the Jacobin clubs of France and England, in common sense. And finally, this is when he was convicted. He was unswayed by popular opinion. The little title here under this poster of him hanging from Rights of Man, Common Sense, says the end of pain, P-A-I-N. And there he is. It's his confession. It's the way that he was treated in history throughout, and yet he rose above it throughout. I want to end with a quote from the dedication in Christopher Hitchens' book about the rights of man, which is a wonderful book. It comes from Bertrand Russell in his work called The Fate of Thomas Paine. And I found that the most poignant of all the quotes I read. To all these champions of the oppressed, Paine set an example of courage, humanity, and single-mindedness. When public issues were involved, he forgot personal prudence. The world decided, as it usually does in such cases, to punish him for his lack of self-seeking. To this day, his fame is less than it would have been if his character had been more generous. Some worldly wisdom is required even to secure praise for the lack of it. And I will end with a look at a contemporary cartoon about Tom Paine. We're with the man who yesterday threw a book at the president, but was later determined to be over-exuberant. An over-exuberant supporter who hoped he would read his book. What's your name, sir? Thomas Paine. Common sense. Thank you.